And joining me now is the Pulitzer Prize winner and author of Dear America, Notes from an Undocumented Citizen. It has been re-released. He first put this book out in 2018. It is updated, as it says here on the book jacket, with new material for, quote, living in Trump's America. Jose Antonio Vargas, welcome to the ToddCast. Thank you for being here.
Thank you for having me.
So, look, look, your career is remarkable regardless of your personal situation. You won the Pulitzer Prize before anybody knew anything about your personal story. And so I want to spend some time just talking about thoughts on investigative journalism and the state of media and all those things. But obviously, look, this is you updated this book. It is astonishing how much things feel like they've changed in 7 years since this came out, or frankly, I'm trying to remember now, what year was it when you went public with your situation?
Actually, it was 14 years ago this month.
Okay,
It
so
was 14 years ago. Yep.
before a guy named this guy from New York descended down an escalator and totally transformed the politics of immigration in this country.
Back then, President Obama was deporting about 300,000 to 400,000 immigrants a year. And I basically put my hand up and said, I'm here illegally, right? This is the situation. These are the circumstances. This is everything I had to do to, quote unquote, make it in this country.
Right.
And to basically start asking questions. I mean, that was my goal from the very beginning. And to be honest with you, Chuck, so that was in 2011, right? Trump announced he was running for president 4 years later.
Right.
Between those 4 years, I had been traveling the country nonstop. So when I outed myself as undocumented, I was prepared for the worst, right? Because President Obama was deporting people. I basically put my hand up. And to my surprise, I didn't hear from anybody. I didn't hear from ICE. I didn't hear from anybody. So I started just traveling the country. And, at this point, I probably have done 2,000 events in 49 states in the past 14 years. And
all right, what's the 50th state? You said 49, which means you haven't done the 50th. Which one is it?
Alaska.
Okay. I've got a cousin in Anchorage. I'll make him host an event with you. I swear.
And whenever Sarah Palin is ready to have a conversation about immigration in Alaska, where there's a lot of Filipinos, I am more than happy to have it. Yeah. So I've been traveling around the country. So the moment Trump announced he was running for president, got down on that escalator and said, this is about illegal aliens. And this was about Mexican people. I felt kind of in my gut as a reporter who happens to be undocumented at the time, that he had a shot. And I remember telling, we have a mutual friend, Christina Bolantoni. She and I covered I was at the Washington Post, she was at the Washington Times, and we bonded over that election campaign. I remember telling Christina and like all of my political reporter friends, Ben Smith, I told everybody, hey, take this guy seriously. He has a shot. Everybody thought it was crazy because he had latched on to this issue, immigration, that for the most part, people don't really know anything about, which is ironic given the history of this own country, right? But for the most part, people see immigration as a political issue. What Mitt Romney's saying, right? What, God, I'm forgetting his name, Rick Perry, right? The governor of Texas, by the way, who signed into law in-state tuition, Dreamer, the first state in the country in 2001, right?
Yep. Well,
so
because he was replacing a president in George W. Bush, who famously, boy, I hope I get the line right, when he said, somebody that's going to work that hard to cross the Rio Grande River to come to this country deserves an opportunity to live in this country.
To this point, and correct me here, Chuck, I think President Bush is still the only president to have ever given a primetime speech while he was president on immigration. I'll never forget this because I was at the Post. I was in the
this would have been 2005, right? This would have been just after his yeah.
And
talk about talk about two tough rails of politics, right? He did Social Security and immigration, which turned out to be, wow, you really wanted to electrocute yourself politically, right?
and President Bush, who ran as a compassionate conservative, who ran as a former governor of Texas, to him, immigration was a personal issue. If you read his memoir, I think there's a whole chapter.
No, it's very genuine. This has nothing to do with politics for him.
Yes.
Yeah, I agree.
Yes. For Obama, However, and at some point, I'm going to get to that. I'm finishing a book right now that I've been working on for 4 years that's going to get to a little bit of this. And at some point, President Obama, immigration was never really personal to President Obama as an
Right.
issue, right? Which is why I think, as much as we talk about Trump and immigration, I think we have to realize that they didn't this whatever's happening right now, they didn't start with Trump. Clearly, there's no due process of law. Clearly, all of that.
Mm.
But from President Clinton to President Bush to President Obama to President Biden to now, this has been a bipartisan mess of really epic proportions.
Hearing you say this, you're it's suddenly dawning on me that the last president to make a positive case for immigration was actually Bush. And
Yes,
the last three presidents dealt with it, what I would call defensively, dealt
very
with immigration
defensively.
defensively, and that's probably being charitable.
And this is where the MAGA crowd or the MAGA media. Did I just
Mhm.
see one of the newsletters call it MAGA media? I think somebody just did that, and I was like, wait, what? The MAGA media grabbed into this. If everybody's going to watch this on YouTube, if all you have to do is
Sure.
go on YouTube and type immigration,
Yeah.
most of the content on YouTube on immigration are anti-immigrant. PragerU, the entire MAGA media ecosystem has been proactive, has been telling their story, has been selling the American public. These are the people to blame. This is what's happening. They're replacing
Arguably
you.
for 15, 20 years now. This has
Or
been a
fit.
continuous
Well,
story.
Rush Limbaugh, when I was in middle school in California, right? So from conservative talk radio to the rise of Fox News to MAGA media, this has been the story,
Right.
right? And the Democrats, to your point, have yet to come up with an actual offensive story to tell about why immigrants are good for America.
No, the irony, it's been the Southern Republicans that did a better job, right? Whether it's John McCain from Arizona, George W. Bush and Jeb Bush out of Texas and Florida, but they were exceptions,
They were, and
arguably.
I want to know. I know some of them, but you know all of them. I want to know who are all these posters. Who are all these posters in D.C. and the Acela Express, of the East
The
Coast
Expella
that
corridor,
has
yeah.
that has convinced the DNC. I mean, I remember being in Chicago reporting my book. Here's
Hmm.
Kamala Harris, the daughter of immigrants, right?
Hmm.
She couldn't talk about immigration. She could not talk about immigration, right? And I was in Chicago reporting on my book, talking to Black people in Chicago who are dealing with all these Venezuelans who had just come.
Hmm.
Their Black mayor, right, providing resources for these Venezuelan immigrants, many of them, going through the process, right? And there is an opportunity to have a conversation about this. And I think in the Democratic Party, and look, I was undocumented. I recently adjusted to my status to getting an O visa. I have never voted. I've lived in this country for what 30. Wait, this summer would be 1993. So I'll be in
You
this country
you came
32
over when you were
years.
12,
I was
right? Was that
12. I
12?
was
Yeah.
12. And I've never voted. Even that lie that illegal aliens vote, right? So with
I
what?
I assume it's the other way around. The fear that you must
Yeah.
have been living with, that you
Oh
would
God.
get caught or exposed or sent away, and you didn't know where you'd be sent to.
And I'm talking to you, so I have to remind you of this. Covering the 2008 presidential campaign, they sent me to Iowa because I was the only political reporter at the time who wasn't married. So they're like, "Go send Jose to Iowa." This was when Iowa had four Starbucks, and I like
Yeah.
filed my stories in the four Starbucks all across Iowa.
You
And
should have
Iowa,
tried to come and go. They have good coffee too, and it's
well,
the
that's
funniest location to
but Chuck,
Dateline.
free Wi-Fi, free Wi-Fi. It was free Wi-Fi, and that's why, right? It was free Wi-Fi. Let me
Of
just go file
course.
the story. And I remember, being on the campaign trail, driving with a driver's license that I wasn't supposed to have, right?
Mm.
All the time,
And renting a car,
just
wondering at
renting
what
a
moment.
car,
Yeah, yeah.
just the whole time being surrounded by the Washington press corps. And I remember covering Mike
Post nine
Huckabee,
eleven, mind you, you're also going on airplanes, right?
going in an airplane.
Probably a fear.
Mike Huckabee decided to do duck hunting in Osceola, Iowa, the day after Christmas, and I went. And here's my Huckabee, right, who won the caucuses that year,
Yeah.
started talking about illegal this, illegal that, these illegal immigrants. I was right in front of him. To this day, I do not know why I didn't just blurt it out. Governor, I'm one of these people you're talking
Did
about.
your employer know? Did anybody know at the Post at
No,
the time? Okay.
nobody knew. There was one guy. I got there. I got hired as an intern 2003. I came back. They hired me as a 2-year intern. Came back in June. I started freaking out because I'm like, I can't be at the Washington Post. Someone's going to find out.
Right.
E-Verify is going to catch me.
Yeah.
E-Verify is going to catch me.
Well, is this proof E-Verify doesn't work, by the way?
It didn't work. It doesn't work. It
Yeah.
does not work. It does not work. And also the racialized aspect of this. Even
Right.
though my name is Jose Antonio Vargas, I'm Filipino. And to your listeners and watchers, if you see an Asian guy with a Latino name, it means they're Filipino.
Usually
There's a
it
hundred
means
mil-
Filipino.
there's a
Right.
hundred
Yeah.
million of us, so you probably should know that.
Well,
Um,
this is one of those things. Look, I grew up in Miami. I'm
oh
extraordinarily
yeah,
familiar with certain immigrant groups, but if you lived in Los Angeles, I wouldn't know anything about Cubans, but I know a lot more about Filipinos. And you
wow.
know what I mean? Like, there's always, and I've always thought East Coast people have the hardest time
Of the
getting
hardest time.
Filipinos.
And
Yeah.
not only that, and this actually, what you just outlined is one of the reasons why the Acela Express mainstream media doesn't understand what immigration is.
Yeah.
Because they think every Latino is the same thing and they think every Asian is the same thing. When in
Right.
reality, this country made up Hispanic and Asian American, identities that do not exist outside of America.
Right.
Right? So to me, this issue, I mean, it's ironic, Chuck, because immigration is in the headlines every day, right? And yet, immigration as a process, like what people have to go through, like
Right.
why do we have 11, 12 million undocumented people in this country? Why?
Because
Right?
it's a
The
hard
people,
process. Yeah.
it's
No.
a hard, it's a hard process. And the irony right now is people who are trying to follow the process are being arrested at this very exact place that they're trying to follow the process,
Right.
which is at the courts. So for me, I'm still wrapping my head around what this moment, what this historical moment means
Let me
as we're
ask you
living through it.
this. We are living through it. And so I still believe today that I benefited greatly from growing up where I grew up and when I grew up. I grew up in
Mm,
Miami in the 70s and 80s. And I always say I was born in Miami and then I graduated high school from Miami. Okay. It was a very southern city in the 70s. And then, as more immigration came, and there were real fights. Okay. We had race riots and there would be different groups, people tried to pit the Cubans against the blacks
mhm,
and
mhm,
community, and you'd have these communities in some ways pitted against each other by other entities, right, that are trying to keep power and state power, and it was really awful. It was really terrible, and then it wasn't. It was one of these things, and I don't know how to
mm,
describe it other than, it's sort of like over time. Over time, people saw the amazing communities that were being built from Little Havana, the amazing communities of Haitian Americans um,
mhm,
that were
mhm,
thriving, particularly in Delray Beach these days and other parts of South Florida, and certainly quite a few Venezuelans and stuff. And over time, Miami stopped being a southern city and it became Hong Kong, right? Or now I'll say today I call it Singapore, meaning
yeah,
it's just
yeah,
a
yeah.
a very global city.
Mhm,
And now and I would argue the people that, in 1980, the county had an English only ordinance and it passed. So that just
not a,
tells you what things were like in 1980. Frankly, it's like California circa 1994 and Proposition, the infamous Proposition
187,
187,
187. Yep, yep.
where, you know, the public was in one place and literally a decade later they're in another place. Same with Miami, right? It was a similar thing.
Mhm,
And I always comfort myself, and this is where I have the luxury to comfort myself because I was born because I'm not I'm two two generations from being an immigrant, right? Third
mhm,
generation. And that is, well, over time, the rest of America is just going through what California and South Florida went through in the 70s, 80s,
mhm.
and 90s, and that we're going to get there. And it felt like we were. And I'm curious, how do you square where we are today with sort of the recent history of immigration politics and the immigration wars, if you will, that we've had in this country over the last 30 or 40 years?
I think a lot of it, that's a great question. And that's something that I'm trying to explore myself. And for someone who's been traveling the country nonstop since this happened, right? I mean, you
Hmm.
have North Carolina where 1 out of 10 people is an immigrant,
Hmm.
right? Atlanta has added 500,000 people just in the past 15 years.
Hmm.
Um, California, California as a state is 60% Latino and Asian.
Hmm.
60%, right? So the demographics of this country, we are going through really an unprecedented demographic shift. And the likes of which we hadn't seen since the Ellis Island era, right? In
Which was
terms of
probably the most hostile.
the most
Our
hostile.
right, the native. When you go, I always tell you think it's hostile now. Go to Ellis Island Museum right now and look at the names.
And
And
yes,
these were just these were Eastern Europeans, right?
these
The
were,
Eastern Europeans were
and the
considered the
Italians, and the
outsiders, right?
Italians, and the
Yeah,
Irish, and but guess what? They got to be this thing called white.
right. They
That's the
hid in
main
plain sight.
difference.
Well, I've always said
That
that
is
being Jewish, I always say I get to hide in plain sight,
that
right?
is the
Yes, there's
main
prejudice, but I can hide every now and then.
that's the
Right.
main difference, right?
Yeah.
And most of the immigrants right now are not coming from Europe. That's why I think the MAGA media, again, from Rush Limbaugh to Fox News. I
Yeah.
mean, I'm still trying to figure out what is Fox News without immigrants. I mean, we're in many ways it's like the first reality television show, and immigrants are like the
I,
cast and characters, right?
I remember having this conversation with NBC's pollsters and a Republican pollster in particular, and it was the first time we had Trump ahead in a primary. So this
Mm.
would have been in 2015, and we're just sitting there going, "Explain this to us." And then you know what he said? He goes, "Well, he goes, look, he goes, if you have one candidate just railing on immigration nonstop 24/7, I promise you that candidate's going to win a Republican primary." And he said this in the summer of 2015.
Yep.
And he was trying to say this could be replicated anywhere. And he was basically saying, he's like, look, this is the currency of conversation with primary voters at the time. And I don't think and I guess the question is it still the main currency? And it looks like it still is.
Well, it still is. And to the question I was trying to answer, was trying to get at, when I was at the Washington Post, I don't know if you remember this era, there was these things called extras, right? There
Mm.
were all these like every once a week to get like a little insert from a community, Montgomery County, Loudoun, Virginia, and there would be
Yeah.
stories in
That
those
was that was
extras.
in that phase of the Washington Post. They still wanted to pretend they were a local paper. But yes, go ahead.
Yes,
Yeah.
that and Don Graham was very proud of that whole era,
Yes.
right?
I
But
miss
back
I miss the Washington Post being local, but okay.
But back then, those extras wrote stories about how immigrants were impacting, right, the business community, schools,
Hmm.
businesses. Like, what's the new restaurant opening? What's the new? So we got to see these changes. I mean, the changes in Virginia alone, Northern Virginia, right,
Yeah.
in the past 20 years demographically, right? Immigrants.
Loudon, you just take one county, Loudoun County.
Just take one
I
county.
mean,
Take one.
just take Loudoun County. It's an
So
astonishing transformation. Yeah.
but the coverage, how what is that? There's a great Arthur Miller quote about newspapers. A newspaper is a country talking to itself, right?
Hmm.
I love
Yeah.
that quote. And so back then, this was 20 years ago now, the way we covered immigrants weren't solely what the cable news networks and what the politicians and what the presidential candidates said. News organizations locally were actually telling the story themselves in a way that wasn't just political. I would argue that how politicized we have become,
Hmm.
immigration has been at the very center of that.
Yeah.
And while that's happened, I don't know. Are there immigration reporters at Politico, at Axios, that covers immigration as a process and an issue? Why are we saying when all those horrible things was happening in LA, so
Hmm.
horrible that Kim Kardashian actually spoke up? That's why I was like, wait, did Kim Kardashian just tweet something out about this? What just happened? I've been waiting. I've been waiting
Yeah.
for like Robert Kardashian's daughter to be like, hey,
Yeah.
this is my issue too, right? When all that was happening, you would think somebody would say, we should live in a country where there are no undocumented people.
Mhm.
We should live in a country where we don't have a permanent class of people that cannot participate in America.
What is it? Was it Max Frost the other day said, "Hey, document everybody. Let's go."
And and here's the thing. So I'm so as I said to you a few minutes ago, I've had a change of status, right? So
Mhm.
I, I was here. I was
Why are
brought
you
here when
confident that this administration's going to respect your
oh,
change of status?
not confident at all.
Okay.
Not confident at all. I mean, confident in a way that I'm telling my grandmother and my
Mhm.
mom, who just got
Well, you
here to like
traveled, you left the
I
country and got
travel.
back
I
in.
So that's the thing. I follow the process. I left the country without a promise from anybody that I would be allowed back to the country that I've lived in for 31 years. That's how much I believe in having a process. And if we told people that there was a process, and we're talking right now, why isn't this the conversation in the news media? Why aren't we talking like this the way we talk about what's happening in every other issue in this country? We don't. And I think we as journalists are also complicit to this.
No,
We
we
are
almost always are. We go immediately to the political ramifications
yes,
of the story rather than how do we deal with this issue? We have somehow an immigration system that can't keep track of everybody in the country. Well, that's a problem.
that's a problem. The fact that we don't
Let's
know,
solve the
I mean,
problem.
and to be honest, when it comes to this issue, we haven't even followed the money. I mean, I remember when so again, I came out in June 2011. I was surprised that nobody contacted me. I mean, I remember I was in DC somewhere, and I was just doing an interview, and I saw like the ICE director across the street, and I waved at
Mhm.
her. Like, I was like, what do I do? Like, what do right? I think we were just doing a
You
TV hit
turn
together,
yourself in.
whatever.
Hello,
Right?
right?
So
I'm here.
literally, and then when Rick Stengel was still editor of Time Magazine, by
Yeah.
October, I was freaking out. So I emailed Rick and I said, hey, I want to write a story about why they haven't deported me. So I
Hmm.
did. I wrote a story. I actually called ICE myself, the local ICE office here in New York, where I was living at the time full time. And
Yeah.
I called them and I'm like, hey, I haven't heard from you. Like, what's going on? Right? But immigration as a process. Why are people here illegally and why can't they adjust and change their status? It's not because we're lazy. It's not because we are benefiting from government services that we don't qualify for. It's none of these things. It's because we haven't figured out a process and all we do is yell at each other. And
Hmm.
both these parties have scored points. I mean, that's why
Yeah.
for me, what I've been really protecting Chuck in the past 14 years of doing this work is my independence. The moment I get co-opted by Democrats or progressives,
Well,
I
and
remember.
this is go finish this thought because this was something
Well,
else I wanted to get to.
but I just remember when Trump was first elected president in 2016,
Yeah.
and all these progressives, were really pissed off, especially white people were really pissed off, right?
Yeah.
And I had to remind them, well, what did President Obama do,
You're only
right?
mad now at somebody you don't like that's doing it.
Right? We have to be intellectually consistent here. I know I'm asking for
Right.
a lot. I know I'm asking for a lot.
Well, look, you did something. Look, I'm going to go back to a story you said when Mike Huckabee, you're covering Mike Huckabee, he's railing on this, and you were
He's
just
railing,
tempted to just say, "Hey, dude, I'm right here, right? Let me
wearing,
introduce you to my story."
wearing orange.
Yeah, don't shoot.
Don't shoot.
But I, it is never easy for a journalist to become a story. And I know I could feel
Oh,
like I was just gonna
oh.
say, you know, I know the cynics might say, "Oh, everybody wants to be famous." No, 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 no. Not
Well,
people in journalism want to tell stories. Certainly, you want to be recognized for your work. There's a difference. We all want to be. By the way, every human being wants to be recognized for their work. You want to be seen. That's not the issue. But we all are trained as journalists. We don't want to impact the story. We're trying to inform, right?
oh yeah, oh yeah.
Um, but in many ways, you becoming a story does help inform the issue.
And well,
But it had to be hard. Like, I mean, how much do you vacillate being and coming across as an activist versus a storyteller versus a reporter?
and you have just kind of dove right into one of the central challenges of my professional and personal life. Um, and it's hard to think of an analogy, but as I wrote in the book, as I write in the book, I had to come
Mhm.
out as gay pretty early because I couldn't be in
And-
the closet about both things,
Right.
right? It's too much. I was like, let me get out of one of these fucking closets,
Is there, I
you
was just
know.
going, how do you, two closets at the same time? Or is
Two
it the same
closets at the
closet?
same
No,
time.
I know. Right.
No, no,
Yeah.
no.
Right.
So let me get
Right.
out of the gay one first. Thankfully, Will
Yeah.
and Grace was on TV. I grew up in I grew
How about
up
the fact
an
that it was
hour
easier to come out of the closet as a gay man than
as a
as
gay.
an undocumented?
But however, I was in the Bay Area in San Francisco. I wasn't in Lexington,
Fair.
Kentucky, right?
Yeah.
So what I'm getting at is I'm still asking myself this question about the difference between LGBTQ rights and immigrant rights, right? There's a shift in the journalistic community
Hmm.
where LGBTQ rights, same-sex marriage, it became about people.
Hmm.
Now, mind you, it's not perfect. Clearly, the attack on trans people, clearly, same-sex marriage, people are thinking of rolling it back. But there was a cultural shift that happened,
Hmm.
right? To me, the 1619 Project by Nicole Hannah Jones is another shift,
Hmm.
right? I remember when I was growing up in journalism, you were not supposed to write about yourself. You're not supposed to
Right.
advocate for something.
Right.
When
Right.
Nicole Hannah Jones said, as a journalist for the New York Times, that you cannot tell the story of America without telling the story of Black people in America, and this is when it started,
Hmm.
right? And this was pre Black Lives, it was kind of during the Black Lives Matter era.
Sure.
I just named two moments where journalists are allowed kind of a more cultural
Hmm.
texture, a more on this one on immigration. It's not, and I'm wrapping my head around. Mind you, I'm answering this question. I'm also realizing one of the reasons why how I've dealt with with a question like that is to deflect. Is it's so deeply uncomfortable, right?
Right.
I wish, for example, I'm of like the Ben Smith generation of journalists, right? Like by now, my goal in journalism was to run a newsroom and start a startup. He said, "What am I
Hmm.
doing? I'm asking people, hey, this is the status. There's a part of me that so wants just to move on from this, and I've had to really figure out and get some help to be comfortable being in the middle of a story that I'm trying to tell that I'm actually intimately involved in myself."
Do you feel obligated? Is that what it is? Do you feel as
Oh
if you'd
yeah.
be letting people down if you said, you
I
know what, I've done everything I can? I mean, I could argue if you stopped doing any more advocacy on this and you simply started a newsroom, started a new just a
yeah,
news organization that was just, and certainly and maybe created a better way to cover immigration and things like that, but
oh,
for the
yeah.
most part, not being central to it. I'm guessing it doesn't sound like you'd be comfortable with yourself.
Well, I actually think that's why I've stayed with Define American, which is this organization that I started 14 years ago, right? When the moment
Right.
I came out. So if you go to defineamerican.com, please check it out. If you want to tell an immigrant story with accuracy, with humanity, and with context, please go to our organization. We have all the
Mhm.
resources you could possibly need, right? So there's that. Do I feel obligated? Yes. Why do
Mhm.
I feel obligated? I feel like undocumented people in this country, I am one of the people, there are many of us, but I'm one of the people that somehow survived.
Mhm.
Like the level of panic, fear, the level of tragedy that we're dealing with here. And some of it, when I think back at this moment, I'm a huge Toni Morrison fan. Ever since my eighth grade teacher assigned me to read The Bluest Eye, I feel like we're all characters right now in a Toni Morrison novel. We're being pushed to the very edge,
Mhm.
push at the edge, right? Like you, you say you're a mother. Well, what kind of mother are you? You say you're
Mhm.
a friend. What kind of friend are you? What are you willing to do? You say you're an American. Well, what kind of an American are you?
Right.
Right? Like we're all being asked to do something bigger than ourselves.
Right.
And I think the first few years of doing this work, I did think of it as an obligation. And as I've settled into it more and more, um, because look, like I don't know when I'm gonna get this American citizenship. There's right now, there's no process, right? I can't just marry my way
And
into it.
and
I
then and
can't.
even politically, I have no idea when we get critical mass to force it. Now, maybe an economic depression after
See,
essentially,
so
that
what do you
where
think about that? Do you think that's actually, now that we're seeing the ramifications of it economically, do you think
we haven't
that's,
seen it yet. I don't think we've felt it yet.
you, I don't think we
I think
felt it yet.
we
Yeah.
have to feel it before that happens. You know, I it is one of those things. I mean, you know, I always believe we eventually get there, and that a majority of Americans do believe America's an idea, not an ethnicity, not a anything.
Mm.
We're supposed to be unlike any other country. We were founded on an idea. Now it was flawed. We had a flawed system at the beginning, and
Yep.
frankly, that's the why my favorite phrase of all the founding documents is "more perfect union," meaning
Yeah.
we're always trying. It's never going to be perfect. We're
Yep.
trying to always improve it, right? And over a 248-year period, we've made a lot of progress, right? Like and yet it depends who you are, right? For some people, it doesn't look like we made any progress.
And where you live, and where you
Depends where
live.
you live or who you were born.
Hmm.
I always say,
Yep.
people say, and I used to joke when I'd get accused of being biased, I'd check my pulse. I'm like, yeah, we're all born with original bias. Okay, where you're
Yep.
born, who you're born to, when you're born, all those things matter, and it creates an inherent bias because it creates you. That's how you live. That's how you grow up.
Hmm.
Wherever
Yeah.
wherever the lottery of Mother Nature puts you, and um, I don't know why that story's unpopular. I don't know why it's hard to sell that as a patriotic story, that America's an idea, and that what sort of makes us interesting is the fact that we are, you know, I look, I'm older than you, so there's this great Bill Murray monologue in the movie Stripes where he's trying to rally. He's like, we're a bunch of people kicked out of every other country, and we all come here, da 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 da. But it's this great sort of. It's always been how I've wanted to believe who we are. That, yeah, we're 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 the mutts of the globe, and that's a good thing, right? And I don't know why we can't sell that story to conservative America today, because it actually is I would argue is a small
It's a
c
conservative.
conservative
It's a
idea. Yeah.
it's a conservative idea, and it's the Reagan. It's the, oh God, what is that woman's name? The columnist for the Wall Street Journal, who was a
Peggy
speechwriter.
Noonan.
Peg,
Peggy
Peggy
Noonan.
Noonan's speech, right, of
Yeah.
Ronald Reagan, at Ellis Island. I sometimes I read that speech, I reread it, and to your point, I think the thing that I'm wrapping my head around is I'm an old school guy in a way that I grew up, in newspapers.
Hmm.
I was at this event recently in LA, and I got off the hotel. I was checking out of the hotel, getting my rental car, going back to the airport, and the valet guy outed himself as undocumented to me.
Hmm.
I'm like, oh, thank you for following my work. And he
Yeah.
goes, yeah, yeah, I've seen your YouTube videos, and you're like a really good influencer. And I looked at him, and I was like,
I
wait,
know.
no, no,
I
no, wait,
know.
wait, wait. Oh, I'm so, wait. I'm a journalist. He was like, no, you're no, you,
I
oh,
know.
oh. And then as I was driving to LAX, I thought to myself, journalists were the original influencers.
Well, I used to say
What's
we should be educators.
we should,
What we
well,
really
but
are, I always say this, the thing that I wish I always had this as a North Star at the beginning of my career, and it was really something I didn't appreciate until, and I'll tell you when I started to
hmm,
appreciate it more, I was already at Meet the Press, and the most interesting conversations I would have would be with first gen Americans who would come up to me and say, I've never missed a show. I learned English watching your show. I learned
yeah,
America watching your
yeah,
show. And I thought, and here's what I would realize. Hey, I got to remember, I'm educating people, that I'm teaching them this system. Because you know what I thought about is, well, let's see if I've done this. When you move to if I go to a new country, the first thing I do is try to watch the local
hmm,
news because I
hmm,
kind of want to understand where am I living? What's going on? What should I know about? It's really about getting your bearings, not just geographic bearings, but your cultural bearings, right? You want to, because everybody wants to, you don't want to stick out and, no matter where you are, right? You want to feel like you can navigate
yeah,
wherever you're
yeah.
visiting. And it was one of those that I know it's like you're like, well, you're a dumbass, Chuck. Of course, journalists are educators. Yes, I know that, but you don't fully
Well,
appreciate. And I do think, and in fact, I actually think we as journalists do a poor job of recognizing this all the time. So for instance, if the country doesn't realize there are 9 Supreme Court justices, is that on the country or is it on us? How often when we write about the Supreme Court do we
do
remind
we say
people
that? No,
that
we
there's
don't.
nine? Right. And there was an old saying about Joe DiMaggio. Joe DiMaggio was once said when he was playing baseball, I play hard every day because I never know when somebody's in the stands for the very first time coming to see me play.
It's a great one.
And we don't know when somebody is reading your work for the very first time
For the
to
very first
try to
time.
learn about a subject or watching Meet the Press for the very first time, trying to understand the American political landscape.
Hey,
We have to remember we are educators. Influencer, fine if we want to call it influencer, but you're educating that guy. That's really
well,
what he was telling you. You're an educator.
I ended up zeroing on that because I don't know about you, but I've been struggling with this influencer economy.
Yeah.
I've been
Yeah.
struggling.
Well, I'm
I've been
dabbling in it, and I don't
struggling.
want to call myself an
Well,
influencer either.
but see, that's what you just had that reaction, right? But
Yeah.
in my thinking in my head, what was the front page? What was the front page? As a
An
kid, oh my
editor's
God,
decision to
an
influence.
editor's decision to influence and to
Yeah.
curate and make sense of the world around us.
Right.
Right? I fought for those front page stories in the Washington Post and the San Francisco Chronicle, and I saved every single one of them.
And
Right?
why? Because you knew, hey, I want my story to have impact. And how do you
The
get
impact.
impact? Yeah.
But now we live in a world that is post-literate. We live in a post-literate world.
Oh, there's a phrase. Keep going.
We live in a post-literate world. Okay, so much so that my wonderful niece a few months ago said to me, "Hey, Uncle, my teacher assigned your novel to my class." I
Okay.
panicked and called her. I was like, wait, it's a memoir. It's nonfiction. You're in college? Like,
In your
nonfiction is not fiction. I didn't make anything up, right? Like, you should know. Can you go talk to your teacher? So, media literacy
yeah.
is at the heart of what we're dealing with, right?
Yeah.
The fact that I even can say MAGA media and say that with a straight face, right? We have
Mhm.
to believe in this thing called facts. We have to believe in these things where these are the objective facts of what's happening. And then I want your opinion about what you think of these facts,
Right.
right? And then let's actually have a conversation about what you just said a few seconds ago, which I think is the most beautiful thing about this country: ideas. What are our ideas? How
Mhm.
do we move this along? How do we make sure that there's an America 50 years from now?
So, so let's talk about what you're doing, which is are you trying to come up with a better way to tell stories? Are you trying to educate? How would you describe the mission
Yeah.
um on that? Yeah, how would
Well,
you
I
describe your
mean,
mission?
a big, what we were just talking about this a few minutes ago, as a gay man, it's been fascinating watching kind of the rise of organizations like GLAAD,
Hmm.
right? And so when I started Define American 14 years ago, that was actually part of my goal was how do I be a GLAAD for immigrants? And if you're watching,
Hmm.
listening, GLAAD is, the
Gay,
organization that
lesbian, what's the
against
two A's?
defamation.
Yeah,
It's
thank you. Yeah.
basically it's about, so if you're a media entity and you portray gay people in a way that's inaccurate, stereotypical,
Right.
all of those things, GLAAD is on you,
Hmm.
right? And then I remembered trying to raise money for my organization. I was in LA in a meeting with
Hmm.
a funder, gay funder, who I said, "Hey, this is my goal." And this funder said to me, this is 2011, "Well, but gay people have power in Hollywood, Jose. You people clean their offices."
Wow. That's
I am so happy he said that and just named it out loud,
wow. Yeah.
right? The
Hmm.
racial and the class aspect of what I'm dealing with.
Hmm.
So I can't, again, LGBTQ being gay. Right now, there are people you and I know who are running newsrooms who happen to be openly gay,
Hmm.
and yet their bias is not being questioned, right? For the most part, that we know of.
Hmm.
We don't call them activists and advocates. And yet, because I'm fighting for citizenship that I don't have,
Right.
right? Whenever I go, I have to. I remember one time I was doing an event, and this journalist said to me, "The former journalist, now activist, Jose Antonio Vargas." I literally looked at him, going like, "I'm sorry, did you like did I give away some sort of journalistic cards here? Like what?" Because again, for me, and then I had to embrace that. I had to be like, wait a second, um, why do I have to be an activist and you just get to be a spectator? What is that about? Why
Look, a
do I have
better
to?
way would call you an expert journalist because you are an expert on this system. The
On
system's
the
broken,
system,
but you're an expert on it.
everything you want to know about immigration,
Right.
I can jot all the I can access my way through this, right? I can give you your bullet points. I can give you all of that,
Hmm.
right? So at Define American, what we try to do is if you are a TV show, right? If you're a writer, a producer, and you want to put an immigrant character in your
Hmm.
movie or your film or your TV show, you talk to us. If you're a playwright, you talk to us. So we have all
Hmm.
of these resources that are nonpartisan, that are
Hmm.
factual, that actually want to help storytellers do a better job
Hmm.
telling the story. So that's the job. Now, here's the
Who's
thing.
doing
And
it
again,
well? Who's doing it well, by the way, these days? Who do you, where's been some standout examples in your mind?
I doing it well. Doing it well. I mean, I think I have to really give credit to the beat reporters, right?
Mhm.
Both in all these organizations, at the New York Times, at the Washington Post, right? There's a guy who started. I don't know if you heard about it, Migrant Insider. Have you heard of this?
No, I haven't. What's
Migrant
them?
Insider.
Is it a
It's a
Substack?
newsletter. It's Substack. Oh wait, yeah,
Yeah.
it is Substack. You pay for $5 a month. It's a guy, Pablo Manriquez is his name. He's a journalist,
Yeah.
and he covers the Hill. So if you're in the Hill and you want to know anything about what the congressional leaders are
Yeah.
saying about immigration, you go talk to him. So what I'm trying to actually do is curate all of this and try to figure out, if you want to know what's happening, how do you know what's happening?
Yeah.
But given that this is going to end on YouTube, YouTube is really what worries me the most.
What do
So
you
at
mean?
Define America, well, the great replacement theory, this idea that these immigrants hate this country and are changing this country and are trying to replace white people, that idea is so pronounced and so successful on YouTube. And
Well,
we
this
don't
gets
have
at
an
to right. This gets at to the whole algorithm, problem of big tech, which is,
big tech. Mhm.
this is where I get frustrated, which is they try to claim, hey, we're not publishers. And I'm like, the minute you do an algorithm, you're a publisher because
You're a publisher.
you're curating content. You're curating what you're actually doing is you're curating an audience to content. You're connecting content to an audience via your algorithm. What's that difference between that and the
Well,
editor who puts stuff on a front page?
but again, this is where what is everybody's responsibility, right? And to be honest, as somebody who grew up in the Bay Area, I got here before Google got here. In the same community. The elementary school they named after me is literally like a mile from Google's headquarters,
That's funny.
right? And so trying to figure out what is responsibility together. And
Yeah.
actually, Chuck, you know, you're in a really unique role here given what you've done and given what you're doing now, right? Like
Mhm.
we in the news media have to do better. And so
Right.
offline, I'd love to figure out a way to work with you about how do we actually hold some of these players accountable? What's the accountability process here,
Right.
right? Because I think that's lacking. And to me, okay, Pew, I'm a big Pew Research fan, right? There was a report in 2015 that said that this country had 48 million immigrants. 48 million immigrants, 11 million within the 48 million.
Hmm.
And then, according to this report, America's population growth, 88% of the population growth in this country is going to come from those 48 million
Yeah.
people. So, we're not talking about immigration as immigration reform, or we're talking about
No.
immigration as like the country is changing, it's already here.
I'll
How do
be
we
really
cover
cynical
that
about
together?
this. I'll be really cynical, Jose. You want to know how I think eventually we will get comprehensive immigration reform and get pathways to citizenship?
Mm-hmm.
There was a little news story earlier this week that indicated that Social Security is going to be running out of money in 2033.
I read
And
that.
guess what we're going to be needing?
Yep.
More younger workers. And it isn't coming from people that are already here.
Yep.
And that will be, look, unfortunately, politicians don't make decisions until literally there's a financial gun to their head. And when I saw that, it's actually how you probably, if you ask me, look, if I go into a coma today and I wake up in 2035, yeah, we have real pathways to citizenship now. Oh, Social Security ran out of money, huh? Like that's what I would assume. And
Here's
maybe,
the
maybe that's
Chuck.
cynical, but hey, look, solutions are solutions.
So
It's
and for me,
urgency.
but well, I got to say though, to complicate that, there are many immigration organizations that have been trying to tell that story for more than 20 years.
And it doesn't
And
catch, does it?
that's what I'm about to ask you. How do we
Yeah.
make it catch?
I don't know. I'm fascinated by every time it feels like about every 6 months, one of a major news organization will do a story about a fairly white small town
Yeah.
who
Yeah.
their favorite,
Their
one of their
favorite immigrant.
favorite immigrant got deported. And they're like, well, he wasn't one of them, whatever them is, right? Or he wasn't this. This is and those stories don't, it's funny how they don't change their mind about the issue. They just want to make an exception for their favorite immigrant.
For their favorite. And
And
that's again, that's
I don't know how we get out of that loop.
Michael Bloomberg. I mean, there used to be an organization called Partnerships for a New Economy. Michael Bloomberg, Rupert Murdoch, all of these people funded it. And it was all about telling the story of the economic contributions to migrants. They were the first people that were in Alabama. The moment Alabama tried to pass that anti immigrant law and
Right.
farmers didn't show up, they were telling that story 10, 12 years ago. So this is where being in a post literate society,
Yeah.
right?
I see what you mean when you say it that way, which is
That is what I'm
not
trying
like
to
we don't
understand.
care. We can read, but we don't understand.
Because Chuck, I come out as undocumented. I get in the cover of Time magazine. I make a documentary that airs on CNN. I write a book. I do all of these things that you're supposed to check in a box. And then you've told a story, you've changed the narrative, and you've had an impact narratively.
Mhm.
And then I remember John Lewis. So I got arrested. I got detained in Texas, 2014. That's
Mm.
been the only time that I've been detained. Right? It was like.
Okay.
And I guess John Lewis saw it on the news, right? So when I got out, when they released me 8 hours later, Congressman Lewis was one of the first people to call me. I had met him at this event.
Mm.
And then he said to me, "Oh, that was a really effective stunt you pulled off there." And I was like, "Oh, sir, it wasn't a stunt." I was like, "Sir, I was not.
Oh.
They just arrested me at the airport." Well, okay, well, I didn't know that, but I was at the Starbucks on Capitol Hill, and there was this woman in her stroller. She was pushing her stroller, saying, "Did you hear about that journalist that boarded the plane and got arrested because he didn't have papers to board a domestic flight? Did you know?" He was like, "Well, you impacted her, so you've done your job." And then we had lunch a couple of months later, and he said to me something I'm still wrapping my head around. He said, "Snick could not have survived Twitter." Right?
Mm.
So all those organizers in the 50s and 60s could not have survived the social media era. Because because
I
when,
get that because there were gatekeepers and,
yep,
national me, Tom Brokaw would tell me stories. In fact, it gets at the heart of something I'm working on, which is trying to figure out, like, I don't think national media ever had the trust of people. I think national
yeah,
media has always been, it's local journalists that build trust. And I've always thought local journalists and the gutting of local media
cutting of local media.
is what is,
Part
I think, caused the crisis that we're all in. National media is the vegetables. Local media is the service journalism. That's what I've always that was the partnership at its best, right? And
yeah,
in the '60s, like Tom Brokaw would tell me stories. His first gig before he was brought to Washington was to be in the Atlanta bureau, basically to
mm,
cover the civil rights movement. And they hated NBC. All the locals hated the national media, but there was no alternative for them to complain about it to. So I think John Lewis is right. I think he's
and
right.
other
With if there's an alternative media ecosystem, um, there's probably still segregation.
and the other thing he said after that was he said that what was Selma about? He said our job at Selma was to get the Philadelphia Inquirer and the Boston Globe and the New York
To get the
Times to
northern
show up
papers to cover. Yeah.
to go
Yeah.
go to. So he said all of that was a media play, right? There's a great book, I'm sure you read it, called The Race Beat.
Mm.
This book, it
I
came
know.
out in 2006. It's
Yeah.
all about the press and the civil rights struggle. And again,
Yeah.
it told the story of all
Mhm.
the white northern journalists going to the South. And as he was saying this, he was saying to me, but we don't live in that kind of world anymore, Jose.
Right.
I can't just be like, what is it going to take? I'm not even sure if, given Stephen Miller, who, by the way, I'm just fascinated by Stephen Miller. I would just love to talk to him, like just have like a actual conversation. And, we both grew up in California. I want to like really understand um, how he got to be where he's at, right? I really want to understand that. I want to understand Charlie Kirk. I want to understand like what this mindset is and
Mhm.
actually again have a conversation about why you think the way you think. And
Well, I look, I don't, I'm not going to speak for them, but I've always understood the divide as I just think that, and it's always been a close call, whether we like it or not, right? When it comes
Mhm.
to is the country a nation of immigrants or is it strictly a Judeo-Christian society, right? And I think we haven't resolved that. I think in some ways that's the ultimate culture war. And
well,
that's
I
been
think
the core of the
Mhm.
culture war, probably going back 248 years.
and I think food has changed that. I think if you
Food
want to change
helps.
if you
Food
want to
helps. I
change
mean, my
America,
favorite, you said you spent time in Iowa during the campaign. I used to say the best homemade Mexican food I've had outside of Washington, D.C. is
was in Des
in
Moines.
No,
Oh,
Carroll
Carol, wait,
County, Iowa. I
wait,
mean,
what?
it was this homemade mole. It was, they were
Oh,
first generation back.
okay. I
Look,
did not go there. I did
no,
not
I'm
go there.
sure. But
Okay.
my point is that all over the Midwest, right? Basically, not far from
Oh
I
yeah.
35, right? You go up I 35, right? From the Texas border to the Canadian border, and you go 100 miles east or west. Most of the independent Latino owned restaurants are first gen, and it's usually every small town's favorite restaurant. And it's
And
unbelievable, homemade, sometimes better than anything you're going to get, in some places, at least here in Northern Virginia.
so what you're saying though, this is the point I was going to make. This country sells more tacos than hamburgers. We have more taquerias than burger joints, right? Like meaning, I
Right.
would bet you that in this country, if you were to ask quote unquote the typical American, they know the difference between Thai food, Vietnamese food, and Chinese food before they know the difference between Vietnamese people, Thai people, and Chinese people,
It's so
right?
true.
Right? I bet
So
you if
is
you and
that
I,
progress or is that not? Do you
that's
look at that
but
and say, well, that's a step?
that's a step, right? And I think again, I remember when Time magazine put Marco Rubio in the cover and they said he was like the savior, the Latino savior. And I'm thinking to
Mhm.
myself, oh my God, none of them live in California, right? Because everybody in California would be like, wait a second, wait, what? Right? We live in a country where there's 40 million Mexicans. Mexicans in this country right now are what the Germans were in America in the 19th
Right.
century, the
And what
dominant
percentage
ethnic
of the
group.
pop?
Oh
Right.
yeah.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
this is actually what I'm getting at. I'm trying to finish this book is I'm trying to ask questions around what makes the Mexican experience different from the German one. Now, mind you, the Germans had to like cross an ocean to come here,
Right.
right? Mexicans, they only had to walk, and for many of them, this was actually their country before it became quote unquote America's country.
Right.
So these to me are the conversations in a post-literate society.
Yeah.
I hear Gore Vidal, by the way. I hear Gore Vidal
Yes. Yes. There's a
talking
lot of
like
that.
right,
Yeah. Yeah.
right.
Yeah.
And by the way, he was right about so many things, Chuck.
I know. I know. And
He
it
was
was sort of,
right
he was a look
about
away guy sometimes. I know.
he was the first person that I ever heard the word empire, the phrase
Mhm.
American Empire. He was the first person who said it on TV, PBS. And I was like, what the hell is he talking about? Gore Vidal told me, right, that the Philippines was the first experiment in the building of the American empire before any American history books told me,
Mm.
right? America took the Philippines, right? And so when people ask me when I'm in places that don't want me to be there, I remember I was at this event in North Carolina and I said, there's about 3 million Filipinos in America, 1.5 million in California alone. And he goes, why are there so many of you here? And I said, well, sir, we are here because you were there. If you could come take the Philippines in 1898, why can't we come here now?
We just didn't choose to make the Philippines a state, and we chose to make the Hawaiian Islands a state, right? Like you just, who knows?
Yeah,
Well, we had a similar relationship with Cuba
similar
in
relationship.
that same, where there was every chance Cuba could have been a state after the Spanish-American War.
And however, these are the kind of conversations. Now I have to tell you because I have to be optimistic. I know you said that look, sarcasm and cynicism was part of my journalism 101 lessons, so I totally get that. Thankfully, I'm also a student of James Baldwin, right, who believes that I have to be idealistic. I have to believe that we can do better than what we are, and I'm hopeful that as a new media ecosystem presents itself,
Mm-hmm.
that people's curiosity, right, that the country are at, we keep saying we're at a civil war, inflation, all of those things,
Right.
is that whoever's watching this, whoever, you have a responsibility not only to yourself but to people around you to influence, educate each other. Like
Yeah.
that's the job. That's actually that's a job that you have as an American, whether or not you have papers.
Well, we just, it's funny with citizenship, and I think that unfortunately, um, or one of the most interesting phenomenons in the Trump era that I think tells me something about our our relationship to our citizenship is it took Donald Trump getting elected for voter turnout to go up. And it turns out that apathy is a sign, voter apathy is a sign of comfort,
Yeah.
right? And it's interesting to me that we've had our three of our highest turnout elections and midterms and presidentials
Mhm.
are all during since Donald Trump came on board. So there's always been a part of me that says, okay, this should mean more people are taking citizenship seriously in their
Seriously.
duties, and there's something to build. That's the optimism I take, that there's something to build
Hmm.
on from there. More people are trying to engage. The question is, can we break through some of these bubbles to educate them? And that's the challenge.
Yes.
Anyway, I could keep going, but I fear that we would not get anything
Yeah.
done for the rest of the
Yeah.
day.
I think we're out of time. Um, there is one thing I want to say, which is, and I'd be remiss if I didn't say this. Journalism is my only church. It's a church I've been praying to since I was 17 years old.
Mm-hmm.
And I think we as journalists have a job to do here at this moment. And I think as much as possible to rise up to that occasion. And I think we're seeing people do that. I think we're seeing examples of that happening.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and I guess my only request is for all of you watching this who cover immigration in one way or the other, like I think leading with we're dealing with people, we're dealing with human beings, we're dealing with
Yeah,
this is
humanize the
actually
issue. Don't dehumanize the issue.
they don't contribute to that. Don't subscribe to that. Don't just call him a border czar and not put quotation marks around it because
Yeah.
it's not a real job. I saw this in the New York Times today. I was like, I almost like had a. I'm like, wait. Did I just see that? Who am I gonna
Yeah.
like? We all have a job to do here, and we owe it to ourselves and to the history of this country to actually live up to that job.
Well, there's another way to put it, which is I'd rather live in a country that people wanted to come to, not live in a country where everybody wants to leave.
There you go. Thank you so much for having me.
It's terrific. Dear America, you updated
Oh,
it. Um,
there it is.
there it
Notes
is. I
of an
have one. See,
undocumented
I have one
citizen.
too. Look at
Yeah,
that.
oh,
We're
great.
like living in through the looking glass. But anyway,
That is not my fingerprint. It was that was a step too far for my lawyers. They're like, do
I
not do
love
that.
the fact though, well, because you don't want somebody copying it. But see, this is
Yes.
the journalist that you are. You are going to make sure to fact check right to the end.
Oh yeah. Oh, yeah. Right to the very end. Yeah. Thank you,
Jose,
Chuck.
it's a pleasure. Thank you.
Thanks.